Nesso collapsed into a blood-stained heap, pale blue blood gushing from the deep shrapnel wound carved into her dainty alien frame. The young Nijin girl's own soldiers cared little about a frail, dying child as they retreated, but the human soldier named Joseph Webb said, "Fuck that shit," and charged through a hail of plasma fire to scoop Nesso up and drag her to cover. Zoltar took a slow drink as Krios shook his head, clearly still processing the shocking events that had unfolded on planet Zephyria, a crucial strategic asset in the war tearing apart the sector. Zoltar could tell something weighed heavy in Krios's mind. Krios finally broke the silence. "I still can't believe how wrong I was about humans," Krios blurted. He couldn't get the sight of the mangled Nijin girl out of his head. Our own soldiers abandoned that kid to save their own asses. They sentenced that girl to death as collateral damage, a casualty of war. But that human Webb, he charged into enemy fire to save her. He took her back to our extraction ship and ordered our medic to start treating her wounds immediately. Zoltar nodded, leaning forward, now deeply intrigued by his friend's tale. "What did you expect the humans to do? They're a bunch of primitive apes." Krios shook his head again. "Those apes are worth 100 Nigean soldiers. When I first saw the humans, I thought they were useless cannon fodder, fighting for the resistance as expendable grunts, an inferior species, just dumb brutes." Krios took a big gulp of his drink, then continued, "But holy shit, was I wrong. When we stormed that enemy compound, the humans took the most dangerous tactical positions without hesitating. And seeing Webb rescue that girl, risking his own neck for some alien kid, I've never seen such selfless bravery from any Nigean warrior. It made me question everything." As Zoltar's eyes widened, he realized this wasn't just some amusing anecdote. Krios's perception of humans, and perhaps even his own loyalties, had been deeply shaken. There was a tense silence as the weight of the story hung in the air. What the hell did this mean for the war effort and for the future of Nijin-human relations? Krios finally spoke again, his voice low and serious. "You weren't there, man. You didn't see the shit I saw down in those trenches." Krios continued recounting the incredible events he'd witnessed. So there we were, pinned down by heavy fire in the middle of a war zone. But Webb, he just scooped up that Nijin girl and held her tight against his chest. He ran through the crossfire, shielding her body with his own, ducking and weaving through the rubble-strewn streets. Zoltar leaned forward, shocked. He risked his life for some alien child? "I know, I couldn't believe it either," Krios said, shaking his head. "To be honest, at first I thought maybe he had some ulterior motive, you know, like he was going to use the kid as a hostage or for propaganda." "Exactly. But then we took shelter in this bombed-out husk of a building, and I watched Webb as he tended to the girl's wounds, ripping up strips of his own uniform to make bandages. He was so gentle with her, speaking softly, trying to keep her calm even though we were still in the thick of battle." Zoltar furrowed his brow. He wasted his own medical supplies on her. "More than that. Webb, he shared his rations with her. His own food, Zoltar. We were already running low, and this crazy human gives his meal to an injured alien kid." Krios let out a disbelieving laugh. "I shit you not. But here's the kicker. As the night went on and the fighting got worse, Webb insisted we take turns keeping watch over her. He was absolutely determined to keep that child safe, no matter what." Zoltar sat back, processing this information. "I've never heard of a Nijin showing that kind of compassion in the middle of a battle. It's unthinkable." "That's what I thought too, but seeing it firsthand, it changed something in me, Zoltar, made me question everything I thought I knew about humans." Krios took another gulp of his drink, his eyes distant as he recalled the events of that fateful morning. As dawn approached, Webb came up with a plan to get Nesso to safety. He'd managed to make contact with a nearby Nijin relief camp using a salvaged radio, but the camp was on the other side of the city, through some of the heaviest fighting. Zoltar raised an eyebrow. "And he still wanted to attempt the journey, with an injured child in tow?" Krios nodded. "I had my doubts, believe me. Webb's plan involved navigating through a network of underground tunnels to avoid the worst of the fighting. It seemed like a long shot at best. More than determined, Webb was adamant about getting Nesso the medical attention she needed, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't hear it. Zoltar leaned forward, his interest piqued. So what happened next? As we set out, Webb insisted on carrying Neso himself. The kid's weight slowed him down, made him more vulnerable to enemy fire, but he wouldn't let anyone else take her. Impressive. Most soldiers would prioritize their own survival. Kreos shook his head. Not Webb. He had this almost superhuman determination to protect that child, even as we faced close call after close call. I lost count of how many times I thought we were done for. But you made it through? Somehow, yeah. Webb navigated those tunnels like he'd been doing it all his life. I've never seen anything like it, not even from our most experienced scouts. It was like he had a sixth sense for danger. Zoltar sat back, marveling at the tale. Incredible. And you said he did all this for a Nigene child, one of our own? Without hesitation, Kreos confirmed. It was a side of humanity I never knew existed. I mean, I'd heard stories about their loyalty, their bravery, but to see it firsthand, it changed everything. Zoltar nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Kreos's words. I can only imagine what happened when you reached the relief camp. Kreos leaned forward, his eyes intense as he recalled the harrowing moments in the tunnels. We thought we were in the clear, but then we heard voices up ahead. Enemy soldiers, at least a dozen of them, and they were heading straight for us. Zoltar's eyes widened. What did you do? With Neso injured and only the two of you armed? I thought we were done for, Kreos admitted. But Webb, he just looked at me and said, I've got an idea, and then he started rummaging through his pack, pulling out bits of wire and scrap metal. Making explosives. Small ones, nothing too powerful, but enough to create a distraction. He handed me Neso and told me to be ready to run. Zoltar shook his head in disbelief. He was going to take on a dozen soldiers by himself. Not exactly. Webb knew these tunnels better than any of us. He set off the explosives in a side passage, drawing the enemy away from our position. Then he led us through this maze of narrow, twisting corridors. I don't know how he navigated it all, but he got us out. That's not even the half of it, Kreos said. When we finally emerged from the tunnels, we were on the outskirts of the city, but the relief camp was still a good distance away, and there were enemy patrols everywhere. How did you make it across open ground? Kreos laughed, but there was no humor in it. Webb. He had us wait until nightfall, then led us through this series of ditches and gullies, always staying low, always aware of our surroundings. It was like he could sense where the enemy was. Zoltar leaned back, processing it all. And Neso, she survived all of this. Thanks to Webb, yes. I've never seen anything like it, Zoltar. The way he put that child's life above his own, the risks he took to get her to safety. Kreos continued his account, recalling the arduous trek across the open terrain. Webb's stamina was unreal, Zoltar. The conditions were brutal. Scorching heat, rugged terrain, and the constant threat of enemy patrols. But he just kept pushing forward, carrying Neso like she weighed nothing. Zoltar leaned in, his eyes wide with disbelief. And you? How did you fare? But that's not even the most remarkable part, Kreos continued. At one point, an enemy drone spotted us. We were exposed, vulnerable. Webb, he didn't hesitate. He handed Neso to me and told us to keep moving towards the camp. Kreos nodded gravely. He knew it was our only chance. If that drone had alerted the enemy to our position... Zoltar shook his head in amazement. What happened next? I did as he said. I carried Neso, moving as fast as I could towards safety. But the whole time I could hear the sound of weapons fire behind us. I thought for sure Webb was done for. But he wasn't. A smile tugged at the corners of Kreos's mouth. No. Just as we reached the camp's perimeter, he came running up behind us, unscathed. Somehow he had managed to neutralize the drone and evade the enemy patrols. Zoltar sat back, marveling at the tale. That human risked his life time and again for a Nigean child he barely knew. That's just it, Zoltar, Kreos said, leaning forward intently. Webb's actions, his selflessness, It went beyond anything I've ever seen from any species. It challenged everything I thought I knew about humans, about the nature of bravery and sacrifice. Zoltar nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Krios's words. And what happened when you finally reached the relief camp? Krios nodded, his eyes distant as he recalled the scene at the relief camp. When we finally arrived, the medics swarmed around us, taking Neso from Webb's arms. They rushed her into the treatment area, shouting orders and prepping equipment. Zoltar leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. And Webb, how did he handle it all? So with a calm I've never seen before, Krios said. Even as the chaos swirled around him, he just stood there watching the medics work, his face a mask of quiet determination. Zoltar shook his head in amazement. Incredible. And the Nigen officers, they must have been impressed by his actions. Commander Zardex, the hero of the Clorax campaign? The very same. He shook Webb's hand, looked him right in the eye and said, On behalf of the Nigian people, I thank you for your bravery and selflessness. You have shown us the true strength of the human spirit. Zoltar's eyes widened. High praise indeed. How did Webb respond? Krios shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. In typical Webb fashion. He just shrugged and said, I only did what anyone would have done. Neso's the real hero here. That kid's got more courage than most soldiers I know. He didn't want the credit? Not at all. In fact, while we were waiting for news on Neso's condition, Webb pulled out this little wooden toy he'd carved during our time in the tunnels. Said he wanted her to have something to hold on to remind her that she was safe now. Zoltar felt a lump form in his throat. He made that for her during all that chaos? I can imagine, Zoltar murmured. And what of Webb? What drove him to join our fight in the first place? Krios leaned back, his gaze turning introspective. That's the thing. As we sat there waiting for news on Neso, Webb and I got to talking. About our worlds, our cultures, what brought us to this point. Zoltar cocked his head, intrigued. And what did you learn? That Webb wasn't here for glory or adventure. He was here because he believed in the cause. Believed that standing up against tyranny and oppression was the right thing to do, no matter the cost. Zoltar felt a newfound respect blooming in his chest. He volunteered for this, to fight alongside us. Krios nodded solemnly, said he couldn't sit by and watch as innocent lives were destroyed, that he had a moral obligation to help in whatever way he could. Zoltar sat back, marveling at the human's conviction. And after the mission, what became of Webb? Krios paused, his eyes growing distant as he recalled the aftermath of their mission. After we got Neso to the relief camp, Webb was called back to his unit. The fighting was still raging, and every soldier was needed on the front lines. Zoltar nodded, understanding the demands of war. Of course, it's a miracle he was able to stay with her as long as he did. That's just it, though, Krios said, leaning forward. Before he left, Webb made a promise to Neso. He looked her right in the eye and said, I'll come back to see you, kid. When this war is over, I'll be here. And you know what? She believed him. Krios chuckled. That's what I thought too. I mean, how could he possibly know if he'd survived the fighting, let alone be able to come back to some remote relief camp? Krios grinned. Months later, after the peace treaty was signed, I was assigned to a rebuilding mission in the area. I figured I'd stop by the camp, see how Neso was doing. And who do I find there, surrounded by a group of human volunteers helping to rebuild the place? Webb, Zoltar said, shaking his head in amazement. The one and only. And Neso, she was thriving, laughing and playing, her injuries healing well. When she saw Webb, her face lit up like a supernova. She ran to him, and he scooped her up like she weighed nothing, spinning her around as she giggled. Zoltar felt a warmth spreading in his chest. He really came back for her. Incredible, Zoltar murmured. I watched them together, Zoltar, the way Webb was with her, so patient and kind. They played games, shared stories. He introduced her to the other humans, and they welcomed her like one of their own. It was like, for that day, the war never happened. There was just joy and laughter. Zoltar leaned back, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. And this is what changed your view on humans? Krios met his gaze, his expression serious. It was a turning point, yes. Seeing the bond between Webb and Naso, the selflessness of those volunteers, it made me realize that humans are capable of so much more than I ever gave them credit for. Compassion, empathy, the drive to help others in need, Zoltar mused. Exactly. Webb showed me that humans aren't just fierce warriors or cunning strategists. They have a capacity for kindness and understanding that rivals any species I've encountered, and that, my friend, is a force to be reckoned with. Zoltar nodded slowly, the weight of Krios's words sinking in. He had always thought of humans as primitive, driven by base instincts and desires, but now he was beginning to see them in a new light. Perhaps there was more to this species than he had ever imagined. Krios nodded solemnly, his eyes distant as he reflected on the profound impact his encounter with Webb had on his perception of humans. You know, Zoltar, before I met Webb, I had bought into all the negative stereotypes about humans that were so prevalent among our people. I thought they were selfish, aggressive, and not to be trusted. Zoltar leaned forward, his interest piqued. But Webb changed your mind? Completely, Krios admitted. His actions challenged everything I thought I knew about humans. He forced me to confront my own prejudices and see the truth. And what was that truth? Zoltar asked. Krios smiled. That humans are capable of incredible compassion, selflessness, and dedication. In the weeks after we reunited at the relief camp, I had the chance to work alongside Webb and the other human volunteers. I saw firsthand how tirelessly they worked to help our people recover from the war. Zoltar nodded, encouraging Krios to continue. There was this one moment that really stuck with me, Krios said, his voice softening. Webb organized a group of human and Nigean children, including Naso, to create a mural on the wall of a school we had just rebuilt. A mural? Zoltar asked, intrigued. Zoltar smiled, and that sounds incredible. It was, Krios agreed. As I watched Webb and the children working on that mural, I found myself reflecting on everything I had learned from him. I realized that, despite our differences, humans and Nigerians share so many of the same values and dreams. We all want peace, justice, and to do what's right, to do what's... Zoltar sat back, marveling at the transformation in his friend's attitude. It's amazing how one person can have such a profound impact on the way we see the world. Krios chuckled. Webb certainly had that effect on me. Working with him and the other volunteers, seeing their commitment to helping our people, it changed me, Zoltar. Zoltar leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. In what way? Krios paused, considering his words carefully. It made me realize that we can't let our differences divide us. If we're going to build a better future, we need to do it together, humans and Nigerians alike. Zoltar nodded, a smile spreading across his face. That's a powerful lesson, my friend, one that I think we all could benefit from learning. Krios returned the smile, his eyes shining with a newfound sense of purpose. Absolutely, and it's a lesson I've tried to carry with me in the years since. Krios leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Well, for starters, I've made a point of working closely with human colleagues whenever I have the chance. I've tried to foster a sense of cooperation and understanding between our species, just like Webb did with those children and the mural. Zoltar nodded, impressed by his friend's commitment to building bridges. That's admirable, Krios. I'm sure it hasn't always been easy, given the history between our peoples. Krios chuckled ruefully. No, it hasn't. There have been times when I've faced resistance or skepticism from both sides, but I always think back to Webb and the example he set. He showed me that change is possible, if we're willing to put in the work. Zoltar smiled, his respect for his friend growing by the minute. And what about on a personal level? Has your experience with Webb changed the way you interact with humans in your daily life? Krios nodded, his expression turning serious. Absolutely. I make a point of treating every human I meet with respect and an open mind. I try to see them as individuals, not just as representatives of their species. Zoltar leaned forward, his eyes shining with admiration. That's a valuable skill, Krios, one that I think more of us could stand to learn. Krios smiled, his gaze distant as he recalled the impact Webb had on his life. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Webb showed me that when we take the time to understand each other, to see beyond our differences, amazing things can happen. Zoltar nodded, his own mind whirring with the implications of Krios's words. It sounds like your encounter with Webb was truly transformative. It was, Krios agreed. In more ways than I could have ever imagined. It's changed the way I see the world, the way I see myself, and the way I see the future of our two species. Zoltar sat back, marveling at the depth of his friend's introspection. And what do you see when you look to that future now, Krios? Krios leaned forward, his eyes shining with a fierce determination. I see hope, Zoltar. I see the potential for a new era of cooperation and understanding between humans and Nigians. And I see myself doing everything in my power to help make that vision a reality. Krios leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he recalled the profound impact his encounter with Webb had on his life. You know, Zoltar, that experience changed everything for me. It made me realize that we have so much to learn from humans, and that by working together we can achieve incredible things. Zoltar nodded, intrigued by his friend's words. How so? Well, for starters, I became a real advocate for greater understanding and cooperation between our species, Krios explained. In my role as a high-ranking officer, I pushed hard for joint training exercises and collaborative missions between Nigian and human forces. I can imagine that wasn't always easy, Zoltar remarked, knowing the deep-seated prejudices that existed among some of their people. Krios chuckled ruefully. You can say that again. At first I faced a lot of resistance and skepticism from my Nigian colleagues. They just couldn't see past their preconceptions about humans. No way, Krios said firmly. I kept thinking back to what I learned from Webb, that leading by example and standing up for what's right is the only way to bring about real change. So I persevered, even when it felt like I was banging my head against a wall. Zoltar smiled, impressed by his friend's determination. And did it pay off? Krios nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. Slowly but surely, yes. Over time I started to see a shift in attitudes among my fellow Nigians. They began to open up to the idea of working alongside humans, of learning from them. That's incredible, Krios, Zoltar said sincerely. Do you have any specific examples of this newfound cooperation in action? Krios leaned forward, his eyes brightening. Actually, yes, just last year I led a joint Nigian-human peacekeeping mission in the Xanthus system. It was a complex, volatile situation, the kind that could have easily spiraled out of control. But it didn't? No, because our teams worked together seamlessly, Krios said, a note of awe in his voice. I witnessed countless acts of bravery, compassion and selflessness from both Nigian and human soldiers. It was like watching Webb's actions on Zephyria all over again, but on a larger scale. Zoltar sat back, marveling at the impact one human soldier had on his friend's life, and by extension, on the relationship between their species. That must have been a powerful experience. It was, Krios agreed. As I watched my troops working side by side with their human counterparts, I felt this incredible sense of pride and hope for the future. It made me realize that by embracing our differences and learning from each other's strengths, we can achieve so much more together than we ever could apart. Zoltar nodded, his mind whirring with the implications of Krios's words. It was a vision of the future he had never dared to imagine before, a future in which Nigians and humans stood together as allies and friends. Tell me, Krios, Zoltar said, leaning forward with a curious expression. Have you had any further contact with Webb or Nesso in the years since your encounter on Zephyria? Krios's expression turned somber as he recalled a painful memory from a few years after their mission on Zephyria. He took a deep breath before revealing to Zoltar, I received news that Webb had been killed in action during a dangerous rescue operation on a war-torn planet. Zoltar's eyes widened in shock. What happened? Zoltar shook his head in disbelief. He was a true hero until the end. Krios nodded solemnly. When I heard the news, I knew I had to pay my respects. I traveled to Earth to attend Webb's funeral. What was it like? Zoltar asked, leaning forward. It was an incredible experience, Krios said, his voice filled with emotion. I had the opportunity to meet Webb's family and friends, and I was moved by the outpouring of love and respect for him. Zoltar listened intently as Krios described the scene. People from all walks of life came to honor Webb's memory. They shared stories of how he had touched their lives with his kindness, bravery, and selflessness. It was clear that he had made a profound impact on everyone he met. Zoltar smiled sadly. He truly was an exceptional human. Krios continued, I also had the chance to visit Neso, who had grown into a respected leader in her own right. She credited Webb with not only saving her life, but also inspiring her to dedicate herself to helping others and working towards a more just and peaceful galaxy. Zoltar nodded, understanding the profound impact Webb had on Neso's life. As Krios reflected on Webb's legacy, he admitted, his death was a painful reminder of the fragility of life and the high cost of war. But I also realized that his sacrifice was not in vain. He served as a powerful example of the difference one person's actions can make in the lives of others. Zoltar leaned back, processing Krios' words. Krios added, in the years since Webb's death, I've redoubled my efforts to promote Nigean human cooperation and understanding. It's the best way to honor his memory and carry on his work. As their conversation drew to a close, Krios raised his glass in a toast. His voice filled with emotion as he spoke. To Joseph Webb, a true hero, who showed us that, in the face of adversity and injustice, one person's courage and compassion can change the course of history. May his legacy endure, and may we all strive to follow his example in our own lives. Zoltar, moved by Krios' words, joined him in the toast. The two aliens sat in silence, reflecting on the profound impact that one remarkable human had on their lives and their galaxy. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.